my father mailed a paternity test kit to my mother and then sent a copy of the results to the court. He did it to try to stop paying my mother alimony. He did it in a letter that I found on the kitchen table, folded beneath the grocery list like a receipt. He put my life and my mother's security on a lab form and a transcript, and he thought that would be enough. It wasn't. It ruined his life. He never meant me to see that letter. He didn't count on me being the one who emptied the dishwasher that morning, or on my habit of folding other people's business into neat stacks. I opened the envelope because curiosity is easier to hide than grief. The first line was the kind of professional cruelty I would recognize for years. A demand for biological proof, signed in my father's hand and addressed to the lab. It was his way of turning something private, our family, into a problem to be solved on paper. He had always been the sort of man who turned people into problems. I will tell you names because names matter here. My father was Richard Hale. He built a small empire in midtown law and real estate. He wore tailored suits like a uniform and kept his ledger books like scripture. My mother was Joan, quiet, stubborn in a particular domestic way, the kind of woman who could run a household and sink a mortgage at the same time. I am Margaret. The first time I met the paternity test was from the kitchen table, and it began the collapse. The hurt was simple and total. It wasn't only that he doubted my parentage or that he wanted to reduce payments ordered by a court. It was the manner. He chose to weaponize DNA, to treat me as evidence, to invite strangers into the most private part of our history. He expected a lab report to absolve him, to let him walk away clean. He did not understand the small consequences of being the one to insist upon doubt. We had obligations and imbalances long before the envelope. My mother had left a marriage once and never been able to fully leave the shape of him. They divorced when I was 8. The divorce agreement had been thorough. Richard arranged the house, the car, a monthly payment that covered the mortgage, and a modest household budget. To my mother's credit, she used the money for the things it was meant for. My piano lessons, school books, a roof that didn't leak. She never asked him for more. He paid on time for a long time. He believed the law could be a scalpel when his emotions were insufficient. He paid what the court ordered and then found reasons to push the line until the rules bent. By the time I was in my 20s, we had settled into a rhythm of uneasy civility. He called on birthdays and sent checks on the 1st of each month. Our house had his name marked in places, on a set of silver spoons polished to a shine, on the deed to a modest cottage upstate that had been part of their settlement. But after the checks, after the rituals, the control remained. I couldn't simply leave when the paternity kit arrived. I had just turned 40 and I still carried the last of my mortgage payments from the collapse of a small business 3 years earlier. I lived in a rented row house that carried my name and a bank's interest. My mother lived with me for a few years after she had a minor stroke. There was paperwork, Medicare, and night visits, a routine of pills and appointments. The house we had lived in, the one with the piano, had been sold in the divorce, and the proceeds largely disappeared into investments that Richard managed himself. For our future, he would say. In practice, that future was a reserve for his audience. Boards, donors, partners who liked a man who could be decisive. Money was always a lever. He had the accounts under his thumb. He had retirement accounts and ownership in buildings that provided steady income. If he asked, people followed. If he withdrew, people noticed. When he demanded the paternity test, it wasn't merely about a check. It was about control. The first escalation came quickly. He hired a lawyer, clinical, efficient, the kind of person who smelled of new cufflinks, and sent a certified letter. I got a copy. In it, he accused my mother of hiding the truth. He claimed extraordinary circumstances and requested retroactive modifications. He asked the court to suspend payments until biological parentage could be established. The phrase made me ill the first time I read it. It made me ill the 50th time. He insisted the court had a right to know whether they were paying on an error. My reaction was cold at first. Anger was contained, a mechanical response that served a purpose, to keep me moving. I phoned a lawyer for my mother. We were not lawyers by trade, but we had one who took calls in the evening and charged for them by the minute. He said the request was unusual, but not unprecedented. He said DNA could be used to challenge support if the father claimed he was not the biological parent. He promptly asked for money, and that was the first consequence. Legal bills, the outflow of funds that had looked until then steady. The second consequence was more personal. My father stopped answering calls from our number. He stopped attending the small family dinners. He had always hosted them at restaurants and then left before dessert. He wrote to our cousins and sent oblique questions about the legitimacy of our family estate plans. He began to ask about beneficiaries with a sudden interest that bordered on suspicion. People who had been comfortable in his orbit for years began to hedge their invitations. The fabric of our social life unpicked itself one thread at a time. He doubled down. He had a meeting with his business partners and the board. I learned this because a friend, someone who had worked at one of his properties, sent a text I wasn't supposed to see. They were nervous. He had spoke plainly to investors about liabilities and risk. He asked them to consider restructuring ownership in order to insulate assets from possible judgments or liabilities. He spoke in that meeting in a way that implied calculation. He spoke as if family were just another line item. My response moved from contained anger to action. I filed motions to keep payments in place. I prepared myself for courtroom language, affidavits, sworn statements about parental duties, proof of my mother's reliance on a set income. I compiled receipts for groceries, bills for home repairs, lists of medication. We produced neighbours who testified to the way my mother kept house and the way I tended to her. Simple facts that formed a pattern. He responded not with explanation, but with more motion. Subpoenas, requests for my medical records, for family photographs, for anything that could be used to insinuate that our history was fabricated. Each legal maneuver was a wave. Each wave brought humiliation. The court clerk stamped papers with impartial hands. The judge wore an expression of irritation at the slow unfolding of family matters into legal entanglement. The community, neighbours, extended family, watched with the kind of detached curiosity people reserve for accidents on a highway. I felt small and exposed. People asked things they shouldn't have. An old friend asked whether I had ever had doubts about my parentage, as if it were gossip fit for the weather. It got worse when he employed public tactics. He hired a private investigator who knocked on doors in our neighbourhood and asked odd, pointed questions. He sent a statement to a local paper posing as a concerned citizen, asking generally whether the courts should continue to support individuals whose paternity is in question. The newsroom declined to publish what would have been a small piece of scandal, but the intent was clear. He wanted to make the dispute not only legal, but reputational. One night, as the escalation continued, my mother broke down in the kitchen. She was quiet for a long while, then said things that were more cutting than any lawyer's brief could have been. She said that she had signed things in the past under duress and that she had lied on forms because she thought it would keep peace. She said she had kept secrets because she didn't want to hurt me or my father. I realized then that my father had committed previously to a narrative that would now buckle under cross-examination. Her voice was thin. Her body was slow because of the stroke. To her, the paternity test was not a scientific question, but a blade dividing the room. At one hearing, he sat across the room from me and watched me with an expression that was not recognizable as purely anger. It was more precise, like someone appraising a painting for flaws. He was sharp and he was polite. He asked the lab to expedite results. He called into the record an insistence that the lab follow chain of custody protocols to the letter. I watched him from the gallery, thinking of how many times he had taught people to obey procedure. The judge, a woman who had practiced too long to be shocked by domestic quarrels, exhorted us to keep things civil. The DNA came back. There is a kind of small clinical terror in the way a lab report reads. Numbers and percentages, sterile confidence intervals. When it was delivered to the court, it did what numbers do. It imposed an answer. The results were negative for anything suggesting a different biological father. In simple terms, the data confirmed what I already knew. Richard was my biological father. He had miscalculated. He had assumed, perhaps by some private fantasy, that a genetic difference would allow him to rewrite obligations. The napkin of assumptions he had folded so finely fell open. He had demanded the test to avoid alimony. The test affirmed his paternity. The court required that payments continue. He lost that motion, and on paper, he had lost the battle. That's the part most people assume would be the end. He wanted to avoid paying and failed. But people do not always suffer for failure alone. He had already set in motion things that could not be easily contained. The demand, the humiliation, had opened other doors. Once you point out a moral failing in public, people begin to look for the evidence of it. A consequence that followed was corporate. His business partner of 30 years quietly asked to dissolve a joint venture. They cited reputational risk and partner instability. The lawyers on their side had started to call him late at night and ask direct questions about the paternity suit and how much of it involved personal settlements. Board members who had once deferred to him now returned emails with a polite copy to counsel. Creditors started to request updated collateral. I watched the accounts we had thought unassailable begin to redraw themselves. There was also a consequence at home. My father's second family, his wife, Claire, whom he married after the divorce and who had kept a careful distance from my mother for years, began to separate emotionally from him. Claire had been an accessory to his public life. She attended the art auctions. She lent her name to charity boards where he was treasurer. She had her own holdings and her own network. After he demanded the DNA tests, she began to act like someone who had just discovered the terms of an insurance policy. She refused to speak of him to mutual friends. She avoided the fundraisers where he was expected to speak. In private, she told him that she would not stand in the way of his legal obligations. She was firm about that, and she would not pretend ignorance anymore. Humiliation is a corrosive thing. Richard found in short order that people he had counted on for favours were less willing to take a risk. The friends who had loaned money in the past expressed concern. The family trusts he had spoken of were suddenly subject to audits. An accountant he had used for years found an error in a filing and, perhaps to save his own skin, alerted the IRS. None of this was poetic, none of it was theatrical. It was the slow, banal collapse of a man whose life had been centered on the assumption that he could manage the edges. My reaction to each new cut was less dramatic than I had imagined. I cannot claim triumph. I could not crow when neighbours quietly assumed the worst and the bank called. I felt tired. The old pattern of being the one who kept people in the house, my mother, my own small life, pressed heavily on me. My mortgage still required payment. My mother needed medication and regular visits to specialists. My mother and I were, for a time, at the mercy of the same economy that had once provided for her. There were nights I walked the rooms of my house and counted the ways things had shifted. The painting my father had given me when I was 20, a landscape I had always thought of as an attempt at reconciliation, sat crooked on the wall, as if the house itself were angling away from his memory. I would rest my hand on the frame and try to remember small acts of kindness he had done. A polo shirt bought for graduation, the time he fixed the roof after the storm. Those memories complicated the hurt. They made it real, not theatrical. It got worse. At one point, my father, now feeling the squeeze of corporate ostracism, decided to take a more direct approach. He petitioned the court to freeze a chunk of the joint investments my mother had in a small retirement portfolio, money that had been set aside through years of cautious investment. He claimed that since the paternity was in question, distribution of marital assets had to be revisited. The petition was aggressive and unsparing. It asked for an accounting of every dollar that had passed between our family and any party related to the settlement. The legal motion was procedural, but the consequence was immediate. Banks placed holds on accounts. The mortgage underwriter contacted me about the risk to collateral. The company that had been scheduled to hire me for a consulting job withdrew their offer after a board member whispered about instability. The ripple extended not only to my father, but to me and my mother. The net effect was that our small financial security, bills paid and scheduled, began to wobble. Humiliation took its next form in exclusion. He stopped including me in family decisions meant to be joint. He restructured his will. We learned of it through a terse notice from his attorney. There had been amendments. Beneficiaries were changed. Things that had once seemed quietly promised, a small share in a trust, a late summer trip to see an old friend in Maine, were withdrawn. He did this with the precision of a man who kept a check register and justified his calculations by the logic of liability. He claimed he was protecting his family, but it felt like erasure. At a hearing, I confronted him. There was little drama. I sat and I told the court that he had done this, that he had weaponized my existence, that he had sent strangers into our kitchen. He listened with the same detached evaluation he had used his entire life. He spoke in a low voice about obligation and fairness. He said he had the right to know. He said the law allowed him to seek clarity. He said a lot of things that sounded like sentences, but felt like measures taken to keep his conscience from being heard. Then the low point arrived. We lost something that wasn't a check or a house, but a place. My mother's doctor recommended a move to a long-term care facility because her memory was becoming fragile and the stress of litigation was a poor environment for recovery. The decision was not sudden. It was a slow, administrative necessity. We could not manage both the bills and the medical oversight without help. The insurance would cover some of it, but it required documentation. When the clinic called to get financials, our accounts were in litigation, and the uncertainty meant that the facility couldn't offer a date. For the first time since my mother had the stroke, I felt entirely without leverage. The place my mother had called home, where her armchair sat by the window and where I had known every scuff mark on the floor, was slipping from us. I went to the hospital one afternoon and sat with her. She was quiet and small and wore a cardigan he had once liked on her. For a long time, we simply sat. There are moments that are not cinematic. They do not resolve in thunder. They are private, heavy. I felt defeated. I had been doing everything a daughter could. The phone calls, the insurance appeals, the grocery shopping. I felt like I had failed in part because I had put my faith in systems that had shifted. My father, who had always been able to provide for practical needs, had chosen to make a point, and the point was being written in the ledger of our decline. Then something changed, an accident really, but one that came from the kind of human error that sometimes undoes the best laid plans. It was an old document, misfiled. I had been looking for a photocopy of a deed for a small property my mother had inherited from an aunt. I went to the manager at one of my father's offices, where I still maintained a small box of papers. Someone young and harried and used to the convenience of email had left a folder on a desk. Inside was an original settlement agreement from the divorce. It was dated with signatures, notarizations, and a clause that made my stomach drop. In the original agreement, amid the dry legal language, my father had signed an affidavit acknowledging paternity. He had explicitly written, in clear terms, that he recognized me as his daughter and that his support payments were being made in consideration of that fact. The paper had been signed before the notarization, before the lawyers, before the later amendments. It was the kind of paper you keep because someone insists you keep it. He had signed that paper and then years later demanded a test that suggested he had not been the father. Why would he sign and then try to negate the same thing? Why would a man who had filed an affidavit later cast doubt on what he had affirmed? I did not understand all the motives. I only knew that the paper existed and that it dismantled the premise of his recent litigation. The affidavit showed that he had once accepted paternity officially. It meant that his demand for a test could be read as inconsistent with his prior legal position. It suggested strongly that he had misled the court. Where the test had failed to relieve him, the affidavit now opened a different door. The possibility of sanctions for filing inconsistent claims, the question of perjury or bad faith in civil proceedings. It was not a dramatic reveal. I walked the paper to the lawyer and placed it on the desk. He read it quietly and asked me where it had come from. When I told him, he nodded and asked whether I could prove the provenance. I could. The office, a place where my father still kept some files, had copies, and the original had been misfiled in the routine of human error. The lawyer called a motions hearing and asked the court to consider the filing. He said the affidavit undermined the basis for the paternity challenge. He asked for sanctions. The turning point was procedural and precise, the way a hinge clicks into place. The court took the matter seriously. The affidavit was a signed legal statement under oath. The judge's brow folded and then smoothed. There is no poetic justice in courtrooms. There is process. The clerk informed us that the filing could expose my father to sanctions and that the court would order an inquiry. My father, who had used procedure as armor, suddenly found that procedure could be a weapon aimed right back at him. Consequences followed like falling dominoes, rational and not theatrical. The board that had been hovering about his stability now had a clearer reason to act. His main partner resigned before a vote citing fiduciary concerns. The audit turned into a full review. The bank recalled certain lines of credit. The filings in civil court included motions for punitive costs, in part because the court needs to discourage parties from using false or inconsistent statements to manipulate outcomes. The attorney for my father's first wife, my mother, filed a counter motion seeking damages for the stress inflicted and for the destabilisation of the financial arrangements that had been supposed to secure her care. There was no single catastrophic moment when everything collapsed. The collapse was administrative. An audit turned into a demand for repayment. A lien turned into a foreclosure threat on one of the smaller properties he had used as collateral. He sold an asset in haste. He signed papers in his kitchen while on the phone with a banker. He called people he had once relied on and they were no longer available. At home, Claire left. She took what she had stored in her name and moved into a smaller apartment with boxes of modern art and a cat. She issued a terse statement through a lawyer saying that she would not be involved. I felt neither pity nor triumph. I felt that quietness that comes when a human life falls apart in the way that human lives do, slowly, with bills and signatures, and the kind of loneliness you can't dramatize. The final legal consequences were realistic and unornamented. He was not thrown into prison. He was fined in civil court for bad faith filings and ordered to pay part of my mother's legal fees. Creditors took their share. He was forced to resign from a board he had chaired for 20 years. The company he had run reeled and reorganized without him in the center. The man who had once been a pillar of the local philanthropic community found that patrons were cautious, that plaques with his name were quietly rotated away. The assets he had imagined would always be there dwindled because of taxes, penalties, and the need to pay legal bills. In the end, he was left with a smaller set of resources and a much smaller audience. He moved into a modest apartment that was clean but not warm. He began to attend support groups for men who had lost status. I watched him on the periphery because that was where the visits had to stop. Our contact dwindled into a handful of brief calls. He asked once whether my mother had been able to move into the care facility. I told him yes, but the tone was flat. He asked if I was all right. I said I was managing. There were private, quiet things that mattered more than any legal motion. My mother stabilized in her new place. She had the care she needed and the staff were good. She told me, once in a slow, lucid hour, that she forgave him in a way she had not forgave him before, because forgiveness for her meant stopping the cycle of worry. She told me that she did not want him to be destroyed, that he had been for all his cruelty, the father of her child. Her voice was steady. In that moment, it was not a grand sentiment. It felt like a household instruction. Let the bills be handled. Let the rest be. My father, meanwhile, lived a smaller life. He had to face the indignity of losing honours and the more private shame of being the cause of his family's instability. He would sometimes write notes that arrived folded and polite. In one, he expressed an apology that used the language of accounting. He was sorry for the expenses caused. There was no eloquent confession of motives, no explanation that made anything tender. He had become a man who was judged by the small consequences of his choices. People sometimes ask whether I relished his loss. They seem to think that vindication must be loud. My life is not about spectacles. I do not believe in theatrical revenge. The satisfaction I felt when it came was smaller and quieter, a certain clarity. When the affidavit surfaced and the court moved, there was a professional sense that the world had rebalanced, itself just a fraction, not for me, for the system, for the way the court leans toward truth when given the chance. That clarity gave me power to make the decisions I needed to make for my mother's care. I used it not to punish, although the consequences were punitive in effect, but to secure what was necessary. There were other consequences that mattered less to the ledger and more to the heart. My siblings, 2 younger brothers from my father's second marriage, were angry on different days. One had sided with my father early in the suit and now felt betrayed by his public humiliation. The other, younger and practical, had watched the numbers and realized that their father's choices had cost them as well. We had, in short, a family that had rearranged itself. Some relationships never mended. Other ones took new, tentative shapes. My life continued. My mother had a room with a view of an inner courtyard. I would visit, sometimes bringing soup, sometimes bringing nothing at all. There were quiet afternoons when she slept and the TV played softly. There were other afternoons when she would talk about the small consolations, an old neighbour who still wrote letters, a plant that refused to die. I would sit and listen. The house still had marks of my father, an armchair with brass buttons, the old painting, a set of coasters embossed with his name because he had given them as a joke. I kept them because they were part of a life. As for my father, he spent his days writing letters and making small donations to causes that would accept them without fuss. He made calls to people who had once been colleagues and heard polite refusals. There was a period when he attempted to rebuild a modest practice, offering mediation services to clients who needed someone with experience. He took the work and was, in his own way, good at it. It was not the life he had imagined, but it was a life with rhythm. People sometimes ask whether I regretted the affidavit being found. They imagine a world where secrecy can be preserved, where a single act can protect a ledger. I do not. The paper was proof, but proof was not charity. It was a factual thing that allowed the legal system to work as it was designed to. The real cost was emotional, and it could not be restored by any judgment. My father's life had been altered not only because he lost assets, but because he had chosen to publicize doubt about his child. That choice could not be undone. There are practicalities to note. The courts ordered him to pay legal fees and a fine. His bank accounts were monitored for a while. Certain properties were sold. He resigned from boards, and a political fundraising committee withdrew its invitation. There was no cinematic moment of reckoning. There were meetings, letters, dull calls, and the rusting away of reputation. He grew older and quieter. Friends who had once enjoyed his company stopped returning calls. People he had once supported were wary of the association. He had less influence. He had, under the pile of consequences, a smaller and truer life. I tell you these details not as a warning, but as an account. Power is not only in the money you hold, but in the way you wield family as proof. To deny a child publicly is not only to threaten the child, but to invite the world to measure you. My father thought a paternity test would be an efficient instrument. He thought it would absolve him. Instead, it showed him to be a man who could be guided by convenience to the point of cruelty. It took away what he once had, the easy assent of others, the authority that had been part of his public persona. We moved through the aftermath the way people do, not in dramatic speeches, but in small recalculations. My mother settled into the care facility and made new friends. She liked to attend the music hour and would clap at the end. I continued to pay my mortgage and to work small jobs, and I learned how to say no. There were practical remedies. We tightened budgets, appealed for assistance where we could, and considered long-term plans that didn't depend on him. It was sensible, not heroic. Years passed. He grew older. He wrote less often. He called perhaps twice a year, more for form than need. His last letter to me was simple, a note expressing regret that our family had been pulled into a public fight. He didn't ask for absolution. He didn't ask for me to move back into the old trust. It was, in the end, a human attempt at small grace. I sent him a card saying that my mother was stable and that we were managing. That was the end of the sort of intimacy we had. There was a long, quiet evening when I went to his apartment, the one he could still afford, and found him packing boxes of books. He had chosen to leave the city. He was moving to a smaller coastal town where the rents were lower and the people less interested in ancestry. We did not speak much. We walked the apartment and looked at the things. He told me softly that he regretted the way things had unfolded. He didn't offer an explanation I could take to court. He offered a small apology, the shape of which was imperfect but sincere in that moment. I have told you about documents and courtrooms and numbers because they were the means by which the life was unraveled and remade. But the thing that stayed with me most was the smallness of human choice within systems. He demanded the test to avoid alimony, and it ruined his life in practical ways. His choice exposed him to legal risk, to corporate retribution, and to social isolation. It also revealed a truth about himself. He valued control more than the quiet work of family loyalty. There is a final, quiet consequence I will not gloss over. He died alone in a hospital in a town I found unfamiliar. Not dramatic, not cinematic. He had no public funeral. A few people came, staff who had known him in his last years, a couple of distant colleagues. My brothers were there, each with his own set of complicated feelings. I sat at the foot of the bed and felt, finally, only fatigue and an odd peace. The paternity test had determined nothing about me that needed changing. The events that followed had altered the shape of our family, but not the fact of who I was. In the end, what it ruined was not just his bank accounts or his honors. It ruined the pattern of reliance that had allowed him to operate as he had. He had once believed he could be the measure by which others lived. He could not. The life that remained was quieter, leaner, and painfully ordinary. There is a kind of resolution in ordinariness. It is not catharsis, it is mere fact. If you have sat with this story for a while, you might be thinking about fairness, about the law, about the ways families fall apart when money and pride get involved. I won't tell you what to think. I will only tell you what happened and how it felt. It felt like slow weather, ice forming on puddles, a house settling in winter. It felt like paperwork and hospital visits and not enough time. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate a like. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, you can subscribe. Did you ever have a family disagreement that changed everything? I'd be interested to hear. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment.